11 months earlier, Nadia Vasquez had walked into a boardroom and silenced 20 people just by sitting down. Now she was parked against a concrete pillar in the departures hall of Charlotte Douglas International Airport, and not a single person passing her had looked up from their phones. The man who was supposed to be there was already 20 minutes gone. The woman who should have been Nadia's last line had stopped answering calls sometime around the third week after the accident. And Nadia's flight to New York, to the investor meeting that her CFO Douglas Hale had been quietly, methodically using as rope to hang her with, was boarding in 38 minutes. What none of those rushing people could have known, and what a stranger in a gray canvas jacket was about to understand, was that the woman sitting still against that pillar wasn't waiting for help. She was deciding whether she still wanted to fight. If this story has already reached something in you, tap like and tell me what city you're watching from. Nadia had arrived at the airport the way she arrived everywhere now, early, organized, with every contingency mapped out in her head the night before, because the world was not built for her chair and she had stopped pretending otherwise. She'd arranged for a skycap to meet her at the curb. She'd booked the aisle seat with extra clearance. She'd asked her assistant, a careful young man named Perry, to confirm the gate was accessible before she'd left the house that morning. Perry had confirmed it. The skycap had not shown up. And when the rideshare driver had popped the trunk and looked at her motorized chair and then looked at the trunk and said, "Sorry, I don't think that's gonna fit," she'd spent 4 minutes in the pickup lane while he reconfigured the trunk, taken up half the curb, and drawn the particular kind of attention that she had spent 11 months learning to absorb without breaking something. She made it inside. She checked her bag. She found a wall column in the departures hall and positioned herself facing the security line and opened her laptop and started working. The investor call was at 9 tomorrow morning. The deck was ready. Her talking points were ready. She had spent 3 evenings on the presentation and had revised the executive summary twice, not because it was wrong but because she needed it to be unanswerable. Douglas Hale, her CFO, had sent her a message at 6 that morning. Reminder, the Q3 numbers will be scrutinized. She'd read it twice before she understood it wasn't a reminder. It was a warning. Douglas didn't send reminders. Douglas sent messages calibrated for effect. She closed the laptop and checked her phone. Perry had sent her a text at 7:43. "I'm so sorry, Ms. Vasquez. My mom had a fall this morning. I'm at the hospital. I've called the concierge service to send someone, but the earliest they can confirm is..." She'd stopped reading there. The concierge service had sent no one. The accessible cab company she'd called had a 40-minute wait. The airline's assistant's desk was 3 gates deep, and she could see the line from where she was sitting. She thought about the week she had built since the investor deferral. The Q4 preparation. The board calls she'd managed with the precision of someone who had learned that the space between performance and collapse was smaller than people imagined and larger than they feared. She had been running Crane and Lior for 6 years. She had run it through a recession and through a supply chain crisis in the second year that had come close to taking 4 major clients simultaneously. She had run it through the helicopter and through Brennan and through her father's careful voice, and through 11 months of rebuilding a world on a foundation that kept shifting. She was good at running things. What she was less practiced at was the particular quiet of sitting in a departures hall at 7:53 in the morning, with the concierge service not coming and the assistants lined 30 people deep and the clock showing 33 minutes, and not having the next move already mapped. She was looking for the intercom button on the pillar when the man slowed down. Nadia was not a woman who panicked. Panic was a luxury she had not been able to afford since she was 27 years old and had sat across from her father in his corner office and watched him explain, carefully, patiently, using all the language of love, that the company he had founded needed a steady hand at the helm. She had spent the next 6 years proving to him that her hand was the steadiest he'd find. She had grown Crane and Lior by 40% in 4 years. She had built a client roster that included 3 federal agencies and 2 of the largest private infrastructure firms in the country. She had not panicked once. But now she was sitting against a pillar in Charlotte Douglas with 36 minutes until boarding and no one coming. And beneath the calm surface of her face, something was working at a lock she couldn't afford to open. The accident had been 11 months ago. A helicopter charter, a site visit to a bridge inspection project in western North Carolina, fog that the pilot had flown into despite her asking twice about conditions. The crash had been survivable, which was the word the doctors used, as though survival were the whole story. T7, incomplete spinal cord injury. She had full upper body function. Her lower body was what it was, which was a clinical assessment she had translated into the language of her daily life with the same precision she brought to everything else, which was to say she had accounted for every door, every threshold, every bathroom, every curb cut in her world, and she had stopped expecting them to accommodate her. There was a period in the first weeks after that she had permitted herself to be undone. Not publicly. Publicly she had managed the company communications, the board notification, the client reassurances, all of it from a hospital bed and then from the rehabilitation facility. But in the middle of the night, in the hours when the hospital quieted to its particular nocturnal hum, she had permitted herself to feel the full weight of it. Not the injury itself, not the physical reality of it, but the fact of what had been taken, not just capability, but certainty. She had been a woman who knew what her body would do, who had mapped it the way she mapped everything, thoroughly, in advance, with contingencies. The helicopter had taken that, not just the walking but the knowledge that the ground would hold. She had rebuilt. She was good at rebuilding. She had the particular stubbornness of a woman who had spent her career in rooms where she was underestimated and had learned to use the underestimation as fuel. She had gone back to work at month 4, over her doctor's recommendation, and in direct contradiction of her father's quiet suggestion that this might be a good time to consider the executive transition planning the board had been discussing. She had walked into her own boardroom, rolled into it. She had not let herself soften that, and she had presented Q3 projections that were better than the prior years, and she had dared anyone in the room to say a word about executive transitions. No one had. What she had not accounted for was Brennan. They had been engaged for 2 years when the helicopter went down. She had come home from the hospital to a man who had, in her absence, quietly begun to understand that the woman he'd agreed to marry was not the woman who had come back. He'd stayed for 5 months. He had been kind about it, in the way that made it worse, the way that required her to manage his difficulty with her situation, to produce understanding she didn't feel, to make it easier for him to leave so that at the end she was somehow doing him a favor by releasing him. He'd used the words time and space, and I don't know who I am in this, and I need to figure out what I can actually give. And she had listened to all of it with the same stillness she brought to difficult board meetings, because the alternative was letting him see something he did not deserve to see. He was gone by month 6. Her father had been more direct. He hadn't left. He had simply begun stopping by the office more, asking about the operational contingencies, mentioning in passing the names of capable executives he'd been thinking about. She had managed that conversation too, but she had known, with the clarity of a woman who had built her entire identity on seeing things clearly, that the clock was running. And she had decided, sometime around month 7, that the only move available to her was the move she had always made: be better than the argument against her. Hold the company, prove the case, leave no room. Douglas Hale had been at Crane and Lior for 4 years. He was competent and ambitious and had a way of framing his concern for the company that made it nearly impossible to call it what it was. He had sent the 6 a.m. message about the Q3 numbers. He was, Nadia suspected, also the reason 2 board members had been asking quiet questions about executive continuity planning. She needed to be on that flight. She looked at the time, 8:51, 33 minutes. She could get through security herself. She had done it before. But between the security line and gate B14, there was a distance she had mapped at something close to a quarter mile, and the airport's shuttle service required a 10-minute advance request, which meant she was already behind. She was looking for an assistance call button on the pillar when the man appeared. He was carrying a backpack over one shoulder and rolling a small carry-on with the loose, efficient stride of someone who traveled the way she managed risk, without excess, without drama. Medium height, broad in the shoulders, a gray canvas jacket over a dark shirt, dark hair going slightly unruly at the edges. She put him at early 30s. He was walking toward the security line and he was, she could tell, running the same quiet calculation she was reading the line, gauging the time. He slowed. She had not been looking at him. She had been looking at the assistance button. But she was peripherally aware of him stopping, and when she looked up, he was watching her with an expression that was not pity. She had learned to identify pity with the precision of a woman who'd had a year to study it. This was not that. It was something more like recognition, the look of someone who had seen a problem and was deciding whether it was his problem. She got there first. "I'm fine," she said. He tilted his head slightly. "I know, I was going to ask if you know where the gate B14 area is. I can never find B14 in this airport." She studied him. He was not, she was fairly sure, actually confused about gate B14. "It's past the security checkpoint," she said. "Left branch after the main security hall." "That's what I figured." He didn't leave. "You going to B14? I need the airport assistance shuttle." "How long's the wait?" "I haven't called yet." He checked his watch. Then he looked at the gate board on the far wall. "What's your flight?" she told him. He looked at the board again. "That's mine too." It probably was. She decided she didn't care either way. "I'll call the shuttle, or I can push your chair if you want to move faster." He said it the way someone offered to hold a door, matter of fact, eyes on the gate board. "I'm going that direction anyway. I have a motorized chair. I can walk beside you then. Make sure you get through without the crowd being a problem." He shrugged. "Your call." Nadia looked at him for a moment. In 11 months, she had learned a great deal about the ways people offered help. There were the ones who grabbed the handles without asking, the ones who spoke to whoever was standing next to her instead of to her, the ones who did the careful gentleness of a person handling something fragile. This man had done none of those things. He had stated a practical fact and offered a practical solution and left it entirely in her hands. "All right," she said. His name was Caleb Morrow. She learned this because she asked directly while they were moving through the crowd toward security, because she did not accept help from people without knowing their names. "Caleb Morrow," he said. "I do freight logistics, mainly corporate shipping contracts. I've got a supplier meeting in New York." He paused. "You?" "Nadia Vasquez. I'm CEO of Crane and Lior." He nodded once, the way people nodded when they recognized a name they hadn't expected. "Infrastructure Consulting. You know the firm. I have a client that works with you, or worked with you, the Harwell contract." He glanced at her. They were good people to deal with. She had closed the Harwell contract herself 8 months before the helicopter. They were. They moved through security with less difficulty than she'd anticipated, mostly because Caleb positioned himself in a way that occupied the space ahead of her and let her chair through without the usual stop and explain at the checkpoint. He did it without being asked. He had the quality, she noticed, of someone who did the next necessary thing without needing to announce it. At the gate, the agent was already making boarding announcements. Caleb checked his ticket and looked at the departure display. "Delayed," he said. She saw it at the same moment. The 9:20 to New York was now showing 10:50. She calculated. The investor meeting was tomorrow at 9. The hotel check-in was tonight. The delay was annoying but manageable. What was not manageable was the thought of sitting in the gate area for 90 minutes with Douglas's message still running on a quiet loop in the back of her mind. She pulled out her laptop. Caleb sat 2 seats down from her, not next to her, and pulled out his phone. He was quiet in the way she was beginning to recognize as habitual rather than performative, the quiet of someone who had learned not to fill silence with noise. 20 minutes passed. She worked. He was on a call, low voice, something about a container manifest and a customs delay in Newark. She had drafted half a response to Douglas's message and deleted it twice when Caleb finished his call and sat for a moment looking at nothing. "Long delay," he said, not really to her. "It happens." He looked at his phone again. Something passed over his face that she couldn't fully read, a brief compression, then gone. "You have a connection somewhere?" she asked. "No." He turned his phone face down on his knee. "I was supposed to land in time to call my daughter before her school concert. It starts at 3. Nadia said nothing. "She's 7, he said. She's playing the recorder, which I'm told is a very serious instrument when you're 7. How long have you been? She stopped. Flying out of town while she's doing things. He said it without self-pity. 2 years since her mother died. He looked at the gate window. My mother-in-law has her for today. She'll be fine. Nadia returned to her laptop. He returned to his phone. 90 minutes stretched between them and the flight. It was in the second hour that she felt it. She had been sitting in one position too long, which was a problem she managed with careful attention to intervals and adjustment. She shifted, leaning forward slightly to relieve the pressure on her left hip, and as she did, her right foot flexed, a small, involuntary movement, toes pressing downward inside her shoe. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. She straightened. She had been having these moments with increasing frequency over the past month, movements that went nowhere, that her physical therapist had noted with careful neutrality and declining to speculate about until more data was in. She did not think about them. They were not predictive until they were. Caleb was looking at his phone. He had not seen it, or he had and had said nothing. She didn't examine which. They boarded in the late morning, and Nadia took her aisle seat and stowed her laptop, and the flight was unremarkable except for the turbulence over Virginia, which was the kind that made people grip their armrests, and which Nadia absorbed without moving because she had been through a helicopter crash and turbulence was not the thing she had learned to fear. At LaGuardia she found her car service. Caleb was 2 steps behind her, rolling his carry-on, and when the car pulled up and the driver started to get out, Caleb said, already moving, "I've got it," and loaded her chair into the trunk with the same unhurried competence he'd brought to everything else. "You didn't have to," she said. "I know." He closed the trunk. He looked at her for a moment, the same direct look he'd had at the airport column, reading something he hadn't yet named. "Good luck with your meeting." She started to tell him it was routine, that she'd done 100 investor calls and this one was no different, that she didn't need luck, she needed data and timing and the right words. She said, "Thank you, Caleb." He nodded once and got into the next cab. She watched it pull away, and then she looked at her hands and the strange solidity of the city around her, all its noise and motion, and she thought that she had not been thanked since the helicopter. She had been given things, medical care, professional courtesy, the carefully managed assistance of people whose job was to manage it, but no one had simply been there without needing something from her in return. It was, she thought as her car moved into traffic, a very small thing. It was not, she discovered over the next several weeks, a small thing at all. The investor call the next morning went the way investor calls went when Douglas Hale had been working the room in advance. 3 of the 5 investors asked questions that were not really about Q3 performance. They were about operational continuity. They were about the executive structure at Crane and Lior. They were about the kind of leadership, one of them said, that could handle the demands of a growth trajectory in the current environment. The phrase was a knife gift wrapped in a spreadsheet. Nadia answered every question cleanly. She had the data. She had the talking points. She had the 30 years of precedent that said her numbers were better than the numbers of the men who'd never had to fight for their seats. She did not get the investment, not a refusal technically, a deferral. We want to see Q4 before making a commitment at this level. She knew what that meant. She had used that language herself once to defer a deal she had already decided against. On the flight back to Charlotte, she sat with her laptop open and did not work. She thought about Douglas's message that morning. Reminder, the Q3 numbers will be scrutinized. She thought about her father's voice in his office, reasonable, careful, saying the words that meant he had already made his decision, and was offering her the courtesy of a conversation about it. She thought about Brennan, who had been kind about it. She thought about the woman who had been sitting against a concrete pillar in the departures hall 11 months into rebuilding a life, with no one coming. And she thought, for a reason she couldn't quite account for, about a man in a gray canvas jacket who had not asked any of the questions people usually asked. When she got back to Charlotte, she went to the office and worked until 8. She went home and made dinner she didn't taste. She looked at the investor call notes and marked the 3 questions that had Douglas's fingerprints on them. She did not call anyone. She went to bed with the specific silence of someone who had decided not to open a door she couldn't afford to leave open. She opened her email at 6 the next morning and found at the top of her inbox a contact form submission through the Crane and Lior website. The subject line read, "Following up on the Charlotte to New York flight Harwell contract reference. Caleb Morrow." She stared at it. It was a professional inquiry, formatted correctly. He was wondering if Crane and Lior did any work in logistics infrastructure consulting and whether there was a conversation to be had. He mentioned the Harwell connection. He mentioned his specialty in freight supply chain systems. He said he'd enjoyed the company on the flight. She read it twice. She forwarded it to her director of business development and wrote, "Standard screening," then to me. Then she deleted that, opened a reply and typed, "Mr. Morrow, thank you for reaching out. I'd be glad to speak with you directly. Are you available Thursday?" He was available Thursday. She had the meeting prepared. She had her associate pull everything on independent logistics consultants with supply chain infrastructure backgrounds. She had the questions lined up. She sat in the conference room at the Crane and Lior Charlotte office at 10 in the morning, and when Caleb walked in, she studied him the way she studied anyone she was considering doing business with, not with warmth, but with complete attention. He was the same. The gray jacket, though he'd traded it for a slightly less worn version. The same unhurried quality. He looked at the conference room without performing familiarity with rooms like this, which meant he'd been in rooms like this before. He sat down and she said, "Tell me what you actually do," he told her. He was precise and specific and did not overstate anything. He had spent 6 years building a specialty in logistics infrastructure for corporate clients in the healthcare and federal contracting sectors, exactly the sectors Crane and Lior served. He had a network she didn't have. He had operational knowledge that her firm's analysts approximated from the outside. At the end of it, she said, "Why did you reach out?" He was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, always. Because I've been looking for work that matters, not just clients that pay." He met her eyes, "And because I wanted to see how you were doing after that meeting." She looked at him. "That's an unusual thing to say in a business meeting." "I know." She held his gaze and then said, "The meeting did not go well." "I figured." "How?" "Because you were working on the flight home, and people who have had good meetings don't work the way you were working. They talk." He paused. "You weren't talking." She had not talked. He was right. She studied him for another moment. "I'll have my associates send you a consulting agreement to review," she said. "Standard terms, 90-day trial engagement." "That's fine. I'll need your full client history and references." "I'll send them today." She stood and he stood and she said, "You missed the recorder concert." Something shifted in his face. Not pain exactly, something adjacent to it, the kind that had been metabolized but not erased. "I did." She was fine about it. She usually is. He picked up his jacket from the chair. "She asked me why I had to go out of town for work, and I tried to explain what I do, and she thought about it for a while, and then she said, 'Someone has to make sure the stuff gets where it's going.'" Nadia almost smiled. "Smart kid, she is." He said it simply, with the specific warmth that came from a grief that hadn't taken the love down with it. She walked him to the elevator. "In the elevator bay," she said, "Thursday I work until 7 usually. If you have questions about the agreement before then, call the office line." "Okay." The elevator came. He got in. She watched the doors close and stood for a moment in the empty hall. She went back to work. The first 2 weeks were professional. Which was to say, Caleb came in 2 days a week, worked from the Charlotte office, and operated with an undemonstrative efficiency that she was beginning to recognize as something other than good work ethic. He had the quality of someone who had learned to do things without being asked. He pulled a client file before she'd finished asking for it. He caught an error in a supplier analysis that her senior associate had missed and sent her a note about it with the correction already attached. No drama, no announcement. He also had the quality, which she noticed in the second week, of not requiring things from her. Most people who worked closely with her required something: reassurance, recognition, the particular acknowledgement that came from a CEO who was also the founder's daughter and had been the face of the company for 6 years. They needed her to notice that they'd done well. Caleb sent her the corrected supplier analysis and went back to his own work. He did not wait to see if she'd noticed. She had noticed. She tested him on the 3rd week. She gave him a task with a deliberately incomplete brief. Logistics analysis on the Duval federal contract, no further specifications. She wanted to see whether he'd ask for more or make assumptions and present them as certainties, which was the more common failure mode. She had seen a dozen analysts hand her one interpretation and call it thorough. He came back in 24 hours with a framework that covered 3 plausible interpretations of what she might have wanted and asked which one she needed. In the email, he'd noted which one he thought was most likely and why, and then said, "But you have context I don't, so tell me which direction to take it and I'll have the full version by end of week." She wrote back, the second interpretation. "You were right about the most likely." He had not replied to acknowledge that she'd said he was right. This, she was finding, was a very specific and unusual quality. She had also, by the third week, learned the following things about Caleb Morrow without directly asking: that he left the office at 5:30 on Thursdays because that was the day he picked up his daughter from school himself, regardless of what else was happening. He had said this once on day 2, matter-of-factly, the way someone mentioned a standing obligation. "I'll need to leave by 5:30 on Thursdays." She had said fine, and he had not explained further, and she had respected him for not explaining further, because it told her he had already made the calculation and had decided it wasn't a negotiation, that he had been in freight logistics since his wife died because it was flexible and he could set his own hours. She had learned this from a stray line in a conversation about scheduling, not from anything that felt like disclosure. He had mentioned that he'd restructured his whole work life around Josie's school calendar at a point when the structural detail was relevant to a scheduling question, and then the conversation had moved on. That before that, he had been building a different kind of career, something with an engineering trajectory that had stalled when Mara's death had rearranged his priorities without asking. He had mentioned this once, and it had been a fact, not a story. He mentioned Mara 3 times in the first 2 weeks, each time briefly, each time without the particular caution that people used when they were managing how they came across. He spoke of her the way people spoke of someone who remained real to them, not in the past tense exactly, not in the way of grief that had become a pose, in the way of someone who had held the grief for long enough that it had settled into something heavier and more solid and less sharp. She did not tell him about Brennan. She did not tell him about her father. She did not tell him about the 11 months that had happened between the helicopter and the airport. He did not ask. What he did, instead, was work. He worked with the thoroughness of someone who understood that doing the job fully was its own kind of communication. By the end of the third week, he had produced 3 deliverables that were better than what her in-house team had been producing, had flagged 2 potential issues in the Duval contract that the client had not raised and that she was glad to know about early, and had requested a meeting with a federal contact that she had been trying to access for 4 months through other channels. She had her assistant schedule a meeting with him at the end of week 4. She told him that the engagement terms needed to be reconsidered, that the work he was doing was not billable at the rate she'd offered and that she wanted to adjust. He said, "I appreciate it. Can I ask you something first?" "Yes." "The company you're building, what's the actual limit of it? Where are you trying to take it?" She studied him. It was not a question her own team asked her. They asked about quarterly targets and client retention rates and competitive positioning. They did not ask where she was trying to take it. "Farther than anyone expects," she said. He looked at her for a moment, measuring something. "Then yes, revise the terms." She did. Her physical therapy sessions were on Tuesday and Friday mornings. Her therapist was a woman named Dr. Tess Acaffer, who was methodical and direct, and had been working with Nadia since month 3 of her recovery with a quiet persistence that Nadia respected. Tess did not offer comfort and did not use the language of inspiration that Nadia had learned to hear as condescension. She offered data and protocol, and the specific, grounded optimism of someone who believed in the work rather than the narrative. In the 4th week of Caleb's engagement, Nadia arrived at Tuesday's session, and Tess said, "I want to do something different today." She walked Nadia through a new protocol: standing frames, parallel bars, graduated weight-bearing exercises that pushed the lower body in ways the previous work had not. It was harder. Not harder in the way of pain, though there was that, but harder in the way of asking something that had been silent to speak, which was its own particular difficulty. Nadia gripped the bar and followed the instructions and felt the burn of muscle groups she had learned to stop expecting anything from. At the 40-minute mark, her right leg shook, not a collapse, a tremor hard and real, the kind that came from muscle attempting to do what it was asked. Tess wrote something on her clipboard without saying anything. "What does that mean?" Nadia asked. "It means we're going to do this again Friday," Tess said. Nadia looked at her leg, the tremor was gone. "And after Friday," Tess set the clipboard down, "I want to make a referral to a neurology colleague at Atrium Health. There is a conversation I'd like you to have with her before I tell you anything that sounds like a prognosis." Nadia held the bar. She looked at her leg and then at Tess and then at the wall behind Tess's shoulder. She had been here before in the way that mattered. The specialist visits, the clinical language, the careful management of hope that had been, over 11 months, mostly the management of its absence. The keeping yourself from wanting in case the want was another thing to lose. She knew how to sit inside a medical conversation and receive it without it costing her more than she could afford. She also knew, in the specific and private way of a woman who had been paying attention to her own body for 11 months with more focus than she'd ever given it before, that what had happened in the last 40 minutes was different from what had happened in the previous sessions. She said, "All right." She went to the Atrium appointment the following week. Dr. Yolanda Pierce was 60, Nigerian-American, and had the specific unhurried attention of a doctor who had learned that patients remembered how you listened even when they forgot what you said. She reviewed the imaging. She reviewed Tess's notes. She performed her own assessments, which took 2 hours and covered ground that Nadia had not had covered in the 11 months since the crash. When she was done, Dr. Pierce said, "I'd like to run an updated MRI and a transcranial magnetic stimulation study. I want current baseline data before I tell you anything definitive, because what I'm seeing in the existing records is not the full picture." "What do you mean?" "I mean the injury classification at the time of the accident was accurate given what could be imaged then, with that equipment, at that acute stage." Dr. Pierce folded her hands. "What I don't know is whether the picture has changed, and I suspect it may have." Nadia looked at the window, rain against the glass, ordinary afternoon. "When can you schedule the imaging?" she asked. She did not tell Caleb about the appointment. It was not his business. It was not something she was prepared to name yet, even to herself, because naming things made them real and real things had weight that could bend toward loss. But the following Thursday when he came in, she said, "I have an appointment on Friday morning. I may be late." He said, "Okay." She looked at him. "You're not going to ask. It's your appointment." He was scanning the Duval file. "You'll tell me if it affects the schedule." She returned to her screen. She had been telling herself for 11 months that she preferred not being asked. She was beginning to understand that this was the first time she had encountered it as something other than indifference. The difference was small and specific. The people who didn't ask because they were indifferent had a particular quality to their not asking, a quality of managed distance, of not wanting to be responsible for whatever the answer might require. Caleb's not asking felt entirely different. It felt like, "This is yours." It felt like someone standing close enough to help but far enough back that the space was still hers. She had not been given that in 11 months. She didn't know what to do with it yet, so she went back to work, which was the answer she gave to most things that didn't have an immediate category. The imaging came back the week before Thanksgiving. Dr. Pierce called her at 8:15 in the morning, early enough that Nadia was still in her car in the parking garage outside the office, finishing her coffee. "The preliminary results are significant," Dr. Pierce said. "I'd like to review them with you in person. Can you come in this week?" "Tomorrow," Nadia said. In Dr. Pierce's office, looking at the images, Nadia sat with her hands in her lap and received the information the way she received information that changed everything. Carefully, with the part of her that processed facts given full authority over the part that processed hope. The pathway integrity was there. Not absent, present, and partially functional, and more extensive than the original injury characterization had captured. There was a protocol Pierce wanted to pursue. 12 weeks intensive. It would be hard. There was no prognosis, only a question that had not been asked before because everyone assumed it had already been answered. "What do you want to do?" Dr. Pierce said. Nadia looked at the imaging on the screen. She looked at the bright patches that were apparently her own nervous system refusing to fully comply with the story it had been told. She thought about Douglas's message at 6 in the morning. She thought about the board chair's careful voice. She thought about her father's office and Brennan's careful exit, and the 11 months of running things alone at the edge of what was possible. She thought about Josie Morrow asking questions at the airport column with no preamble and no apology and zero interest in the version of the answer that was easier to give. "Tell me what the full protocol looks like," she said. She did not tell Caleb about the imaging results for 3 weeks, not because she was hiding it, because she was still calibrating whether she could hold it while also running the company and managing Douglas and building the dot relationship and doing all the other things that did not pause for the possibility of something that might change everything. She told him eventually, not as a disclosure, not as a plan, just because he was there, late on a Tuesday evening, and she had been holding it long enough. "The imaging came back with something unexpected," she said. "I'm starting a new therapy protocol." He looked at her steadily. "I don't know what the outcome is. I'm not telling you because I want anything from you. I'm telling you because you didn't ask and I would like to." She paused. "Just so someone knows," he said. "I'm glad you told me." She nodded once and went to her office. She thought about that sentence for the rest of the evening. Not its content, its quality, the plainness of it, the complete absence of performance. She had been surrounded for 11 months by people whose reactions to her situation were managed performances of one kind or another. Sympathy, professionalism, the calibrated neutrality of people who weren't sure what she needed but were sure they should appear to handle it correctly. He had said, "I'm glad you told me." That was all. It landed the way plain, true things landed when you hadn't heard one in a while. She filed it in the category of things she was not yet naming and went asleep. The third month began with a complication she had been expecting. Douglas Hale called a meeting of the executive team on a Monday morning in October, framed as a quarterly operations review. Nadia had been in enough of these rooms to know the difference between a review and an operation. The review was the cover, what Douglas had built, while she had been managing the investor deferral and the PT schedule and the quiet, accumulating evidence of something that might be changing in her body, was a case. He had documentation. Nadia had missed 4 client calls in the past 90 days, 2 because of medical appointments she had rescheduled, 1 because of a conflict she had personally handled with a call back within the hour, 1 that was not a miss at all but a reschedule she'd logged. He had notes from 2 board members who had expressed concern about executive availability. He had framed it perfectly in the language of the company's fiduciary responsibility during a growth period. He had not sent it to the board yet. He had sent it to her, which was, she understood, the power move. He was giving her the choice between addressing it quietly or watching it escalate. Both options served him. Addressing it quietly required her to accept the frame. Escalating it required the board to weigh in, which was exactly the result Douglas wanted. He was, she had to admit, good at this. She had hired him because he was good at the operational machinery, the financial controls, the compliance structures, the careful maintenance of the mechanisms that kept a growing company from tearing itself apart. She had not fully calculated what it meant to give that capability to someone who had also decided he wanted what she had. The executive team meeting lasted 90 minutes. Douglas had brought his documentation. The CFO of the company she had built, with a folder of evidence about her availability in a room where she had once reduced 20 people to silence just by walking in. She let him present it. She asked 3 questions. She noted 2 errors in his data. She said at the end that she would respond in writing by Thursday. After the team dispersed, she stayed in the conference room and looked at the table for a moment. Not anger, something colder and more useful than anger. Douglas had been making this argument for 11 months, in various registers, and the fact that he had now put it in writing told her he believed he had enough to make it stick, which meant he had been working the board longer than she'd tracked, and that 2 members she had thought were neutral were less neutral than she'd believed. The thing about Douglas's play was that it was not wrong. Not entirely. He had been at this company for 4 years. He knew where the weight was and he had placed it accurately. She had missed the calls he documented. She had been managing a recovery and a board and a therapy protocol and a new venture framework all simultaneously, and she had done it at 90% instead of 100, and 90% was still excellent, but Douglas knew the difference. The difference was the argument. She went to Caleb's office. She told him about the meeting. She told him about the 4 calls, about the board member conversations, about the way Douglas had structured it. She told him without looking for a reaction. She was talking the way she'd learned to talk to Tess in PT sessions, factually, without the layer of performance she usually brought to professional conversations. Caleb listened. He didn't take notes. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he said, "Is the case accurate, the missed calls?" 1 was accurate, 3 were not. Then that's where you start. He leaned back. Don't address the framing, correct the data. Once the data falls apart, the framing goes with it. I know that. I know you know that. He met her eyes. You're not here for strategy. She looked at him. He was right, and she didn't know what to do with being right, called by someone who had been working with her for 3 months and had somehow learned to see past the things she put in front of herself. Douglas has been at this company for 4 years, she said. He knows how it runs. He knows the board. He knows where the soft spots are in my authority, and he has been pressing them for 11 months with the patience of a man who has decided this is a long game. She stopped. And the frustrating thing, the thing I cannot fix, is that his concern isn't entirely fabricated. The last 11 months have cost the company something, not in performance, in presence, in my being fully there. I know it and he knows it, and anyone paying attention knows it. Caleb was quiet. I'm not going to be undermined by someone who has never built anything, she said. I built this company. I grew it from 18 clients to 90. I held it together through a recession and a supply chain crisis and a global restructuring of the infrastructure sector. She said it without volume, without performance, which made it land differently than if she'd said it in a boardroom. And I came back to work 8 months after a helicopter crash at T7, incomplete spinal cord injury, and I am still here, and Douglas Hale is running meetings about my availability while I'm here at 7 in the morning. Caleb said, "Yeah, that's your response. What would you like me to say?" She looked at him. "Nothing, I needed to say it. I know." He handed her the draft of the Duval analysis he'd been working on. "For what it's worth, everything you just said is true. And you should probably eat lunch before you answer his document, because I've seen how you work when you skip it." She almost laughed. Not quite. Something in the neighborhood of it. She took the Duval document. "Thursday," she said. "I'll have a response to him by Thursday." "I know you will." She went back to her office. She spent Tuesday and Wednesday building the counter case, which was not difficult because the facts were on her side. The corrected call log, the timestamps, the client documentation that showed not just adequate coverage, but excellent work during the same period Douglas had characterized as compromised. She went further than the correction. She built the affirmative record. 2 client letters of commendation from the 90-day period. The new federal contract opportunity that Caleb had brought in, documented as originating in her strategic direction. The Q4 expansion framework that she had been developing in parallel with everything else. The response was not defensive. It was the record. She also made 2 phone calls. One to Marcus Chen, who had been on the board since year 2 and whose respect she had earned by being right about the supply chain crisis before anyone else saw it. One to Diane Park, who had joined the board 18 months ago and whose vote, in October, was less certain, but whose particular concern was long-term operational stability. She called neither of them about Douglas. She called Marcus about the Q4 expansion, and she called Diane about the federal fund opportunity. And in both conversations, she talked about the future of the company with the specificity of someone who had been thinking about nothing else, because she had been. By the time she sent Douglas the response on Thursday morning, she had already moved the weight. The response was ready by Wednesday evening. She sent it Thursday morning. She CC'd the board chair. Douglas's reply arrived 3 hours later. Professionally worded, noted with thanks, no further action required. She read it twice and put it in a folder and went to her PT session. At the session, Tess said, "I have the results from Dr. Pierce." The MRI had shown something. Not a reversal, Tess was careful to say that twice, but preserved neural pathway integrity in 3 muscle groups below the injury level that had not been characterized in the original imaging. There was activity where there had been designated absence. What this meant, practically speaking, was a question that Dr. Pierce wanted to explore through a more intensive rehabilitation protocol. She wants to start a new program, Tess said. 12 weeks minimum. Electrical stimulation, neural pathway reactivation, graduated weight-bearing work. More intensive than what we've been doing. What are the realistic outcomes? She's not ready to project outcomes. She said, and I'm quoting her, that the imaging shows a door that was assumed closed and she wants to find out what's behind it. Nadia sat with her hands in her lap. She looked at the parallel bars she'd been working on for 3 weeks. She looked at her legs. She thought about the airport column, the 33 minutes, the concierge service that hadn't come. She thought about Brennan's careful voice saying, I don't know who I am in this. She thought about her father's voice saying the company needs. She had spent 11 months learning to exist in a world that did not stop to ask what she needed, and she had done it well, and she had kept the company and held the board and done everything that needed doing, and she had done all of it without a door she'd let herself hope about. Tell Dr. Pierce yes, she said. Schedule it. She left the PT clinic and drove to the office. Caleb was at his desk when she passed his door. He looked up and she kept walking, and then she stopped and went back. The imaging came back with something unexpected, she said. I'm starting a new therapy protocol. He looked at her steadily. I don't know what the outcome is. I'm not telling you because I want anything from you. I'm telling you because you didn't ask and I would like to. She paused. Just so someone knows, he said. I'm glad you told me. She nodded once and went to her office. November was the month things began to come apart in the way that things came apart when they were actually being rebuilt. The new protocol was harder than anything she had done in the previous 8 months. Dr. Pierce's team ran 3 sessions a week: electrical stimulation, weight-bearing progressions, sensory mapping that pushed her nervous system into territory she had not visited in 11 months. She came out of sessions in a way she hadn't come out of the previous work, not depleted, but charged, which was a different kind of exhaustion, the kind that came from something being asked rather than nothing being asked. The nights were difficult. There was a period in the second week of the new protocol where she lay awake between 2 and 4 in the morning with her body doing things she didn't have a vocabulary for: not pain, not sensation in the clean sense, but a kind of noise, the sound of systems that had been quiet for 11 months discovering they had something to say. She managed it the way she managed difficult things, without help, without complaint, by waiting for it to pass. It passed. She got up at 5:30 and went to work. She did not miss client calls. She adjusted her morning schedule to accommodate the sessions and worked later in the evenings and answered Douglas's bi-weekly check-ins with the data they required and nothing else. She was aware, with the precision of someone who had been managing this particular situation for months, that Douglas was still watching. The October response had not ended his attention. It had shifted its register. He was quieter now, which meant he was working something she hadn't surfaced yet. Caleb's work had expanded through November into something that was starting to look less like a consulting engagement and more like a partnership. He had brought a new federal contract opportunity through a contact at his previous client, a Department of Transportation Accessibility Infrastructure project that Crane and Lior was perfectly positioned for but had no existing relationship to access. He presented it in a meeting with her senior team with the same clean directness he brought to everything, and she watched her team respond to it and saw, in the way they responded, what she had been watching happen for 3 months. They trusted him, not because he'd asked for their trust, because he'd done the work in a way that made trust the natural outcome. He answered questions fully and didn't hedge when he didn't know something and followed up in writing without being asked. Her senior operations director, a meticulous woman named Rhonda who had been at the company for 5 years and reserved judgment about everyone new until they'd earned it the slow way, had told Nadia in the hallway after the meeting, "He's good." Said it the way Rhonda said everything economically, as a fact, not an endorsement. After the meeting, Nadia asked Caleb to stay. "The dot opportunity," she said. "You've been sitting on it for how long?" 6 weeks. I wanted to understand the full scope before I brought it. You could have brought it at 4 weeks and let us scope it. I could have. He looked at her. But the strongest version of the pitch needed the relationship mapping I hadn't finished yet. She studied him. What relationship mapping? He pulled out a document she had not seen, a network map of the DOT project stakeholders, annotated with connection notes, flagging 3 entry points that Crane and Lior's existing relationships could leverage. He had built it in his own time, outside the standard engagement scope. She looked at it for a long time. "This is beyond the contract," she said. "I know." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I was thinking about what this company could be if it moved into this space, and I got interested. I kept working." He shrugged slightly. "That's how I work." She set the document down. She looked at it and then at him and then at it again. "I want to talk about the engagement terms," she said. He nodded. "What you're doing now is not what I hired you for. It's more than that, and I've been treating it like a consulting engagement because that's what it started as." She looked at him directly. "I'd like to discuss something more formal, a structured co-development role on a potential new venture." He held her gaze. "What kind of venture?" She told him what she'd been thinking about since October, since Douglas's dossier, since the meeting where the board members had asked their quiet questions about executive continuity. She had been watching the infrastructure consulting landscape since the helicopter, from a vantage point she hadn't chosen and had not been able to change. She had spent 11 months watching her own company navigate a world built for people who didn't have to map every door before they walked through it. She had watched her own clients, federal agencies, healthcare systems, infrastructure firms, try to address accessibility in their systems and produce results that were technically compliant and operationally inadequate. There was a gap there. She knew what the gap was because she had lived inside it. She explained the concept: an independent entity, spun out from Crane and Lior but separately capitalized, focused on infrastructure accessibility consulting with a proprietary framework she had been building in her head for 6 months. Federal contracts, corporate compliance work, and a technology component that would require exactly the logistics infrastructure expertise Caleb had. When she finished, Caleb was quiet for a long time. "That's a real idea," he said. "I know. It's also a lot of work to build while running Crane and Lior." "I know that too." He looked at the stakeholder document he'd spent 6 weeks on. "What would my role be?" "Co-founder, operations lead, the logistics and supply chain infrastructure side." She paused. "You need to leave the consulting engagement to do it. I can't have a co-founder on an hourly contract." He was still for a moment. Then he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why me?" "You could bring in someone with a larger network." She thought about the airport column, the boarding pass he'd been holding for a Charlotte to New York flight that had already closed when he'd spent 15 minutes helping her through security, which she had only realized when she'd asked about the delay and he'd said his flight had been the 9:20, not the 10:50. He had missed his flight. He had not mentioned it. "Because you did the work before you were asked," she said. "Because you see the whole problem instead of the part you were hired for." She held his gaze. "And because you have been in this office for 3 months and you have not once looked at my chair and recalibrated what you expected from me." He looked at her steadily. "That last one matters more than you probably think it should," she said. "It shouldn't need to matter at all," he said. She felt something shift at that, not warmth exactly, but something in its direction. The way a room felt when a door was open that had been closed for a long time. "No," she said, "it shouldn't." He looked out the window at the Charlotte evening, the city doing its November thing, bare trees, early dark, the particular quality of light that came with the last weeks before December committed. "I'll need to think about the financial terms," he said. "I have Josie to think about." "Of course, take the week." He took 3 days. He came back on Thursday and said yes. The month between Thanksgiving and December was the month that the work stopped being just the work. It happened gradually, in the way things happen between people who were spending most of their productive hours in proximity. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulation of small moments that added up to something that had no clean category yet. She noticed, in the second week of December, that she had started adjusting her schedule to have Caleb in the building on the days she had meetings she was less sure of. Not because she needed him in the room. She had been managing difficult meetings alone for 6 years. Because having him nearby had become, without her planning it, a kind of ballast. She noticed that she had started telling him things. Not the managed professional version, the actual version. She told him about the nights when the new protocol made her body loud and strange and difficult. She told him, with more detail than she'd given anyone, what it was actually like to be building a company and a rehabilitation protocol simultaneously, what the dual exhaustion of it felt like, what it cost when the work spilled into the hours she was supposed to be resting. He listened the way he listened to everything, fully, without rushing toward a response. He told her in return about the year after Mara, the specific texture of it, the way grief had reorganized everything he'd thought he knew about himself, not just the loss of her, but the loss of the version of himself that had existed in relation to her. The way he'd spent the first year in motion, filling every hour with the logistics of Josie and the work and the new routines, because stopping meant the quiet came in, and the quiet was where the real grief lived. He'd gotten better at the quiet eventually, he said. Not comfortable with it, better at it. She understood that. She told him, one evening late in November, about the conversation with Tess after the October session, the one where Tess had said the word prognosis for the first time and meant something different by it than she'd ever meant it before. She told him what it felt like to hear that. Not the clinical version, the other version. The version where a door she had sealed shut for 11 months was being opened by someone who thought there might still be something behind it. He was quiet after that for a long time. Then he said, "Are you scared?" She looked at him. "That it might be real," he said. "Are you scared of it?" She sat with the question. The honest answer took a moment. "I'm scared of wanting it and losing it again," she said. "I know how to live without hoping. I don't know how to lose hope twice." He nodded once. He said, "That makes complete sense." No reassurance. No argument against the fear. Just, "That makes complete sense." She had been given a lot of reassurance in 11 months. None of it had helped. This did. She went home that evening and sat in her apartment with the lights on and the city outside and the particular quiet that came at the end of long days, and she thought about what it meant to be known by someone who was not trying to manage what they found there. It was, she thought, a very specific thing. She was still not naming it. The month between Thanksgiving and Christmas was the month Josie came to the office. Nadia had known about Josie in the way she knew about the important things in Caleb's life. Clearly, through the specific texture of what he said and what he didn't, through the Thursday schedule that nothing moved, through the way he spoke about her as someone solid and central rather than someone requiring management. Josie had come up in conversations the way real things came up, without preamble. The school closed for a staff day on a December Wednesday. Caleb's mother-in-law had a dental appointment. He sent Nadia a message at 7 in the morning, "School's closed today. Josie can stay with my neighbor or I can bring her in if that's acceptable. She's quiet when she's working on something." Nadia looked at the day's schedule. Board call in the afternoon. Morning relatively clear. She typed back, "Bring her." Josie Morrow was 7 years old and had her father's eyes and a seriousness of focus that Nadia recognized immediately as the kind that got mistaken for shyness until you watched long enough. She arrived holding a backpack and a sketchbook, and she surveyed the Crane and Lior reception area with the methodical attention of someone taking inventory. "This is where you work," she said to her father. "This is where Ms. Vasquez works. I work here too right now." Josie looked at Nadia. "Do you own it?" "Yes," Nadia said. Josie processed this. "My dad says you built it." "I did." "How?" Nadia looked at Caleb. He had the expression of a man who had tried to stop a question and failed before it started. "One client at a time," Nadia said. "Then 2 clients, then 20. Josie seemed to find this satisfactory. She looked at Nadia's chair with the direct, uncomplicated curiosity of a child who hadn't learned to pretend she hadn't noticed it. "Does it go fast?" she asked. "Faster than walking." "Can I try it later?" "Josie," Caleb said. "It's fine," Nadia said. She looked at the girl. "Maybe later if you stay out of the way while we work." "I'm always out of the way," Josie said with the mild confidence of someone reporting a fact. She was. She set herself up in the small corner of Nadia's office with her sketchbook and a set of pencils she arranged with the precision of someone who took this seriously, and she drew. She drew the office. She drew the window. She drew Nadia's desk from an angle that required her to move her position 3 times without being asked to. At noon, Nadia's assistant brought in lunch, 3 plates. Josie looked at the third plate. "Is that for me?" "It's whoever wants it," Nadia said. Josie picked up her plate and moved it to the chair beside Nadia's desk, which was not the chair she'd been in all morning. She ate and drew simultaneously, which was apparently a skill she had developed to a high degree. "What are you drawing?" Nadia asked. Josie turned the sketchbook. She had drawn the conference room as seen through the glass wall, the long table, the chairs, the whiteboard with the stakeholder map still visible. She had drawn it with the light coming in from the left and casting long shadows, which was, Nadia noticed, accurate. "That's the stakeholder map on the whiteboard," Nadia said. "I didn't know what it was," Josie said. "I just drew what was there." Nadia studied the drawing. The proportions weren't precise, but the attention was. The relationship between the objects, the way the shadows fell, the way the whiteboard sat at an angle that made it readable from the conference room door, all of it was observed and placed. "You draw a lot," Nadia said. "Every day." Josie turned the page. "My mom drew. Dad has her drawings at home." Nadia looked at the drawing. "Would you sign it?" Josie looked up. "Why?" "Because you made it. Drawings should be signed." Josie considered this. She turned back to the drawing and in the bottom right corner signed it in careful capital letters, Josie Morrow. She tore it out and set it on Nadia's desk. "You can have that one," she said. Nadia looked at it. "Thank you." Josie went back to drawing. Caleb from across the office met Nadia's eyes briefly. She looked away first. She picked up the drawing and set it on the shelf behind her desk against the wall, propped between 2 report binders. Later in the afternoon, when Caleb was on a call and Josie had migrated from the corner to the chair by the window, she said to Nadia without looking up, "Are you and my dad friends?" Nadia looked up from her screen. "We work together." "I know." Josie turned the page. "But are you friends?" "I think so, yes." Josie nodded. "He's different when he talks about work now, happier than before." She said it the way she said everything, factually, without pressure, as though she were noting the weather. Nadia said nothing. "He wasn't always sad," Josie said. "But after my mom died, he was quiet for a long time. Not like he didn't talk, just like he was somewhere else a little." She looked up at Nadia. "He's not somewhere else as much now." Nadia held the girl's gaze. 7 years old and already doing the kind of paying attention most adults had learned not to. "Your dad is very good at his work," Nadia said. Josie looked at her steadily. "That's not what I said." "No, it wasn't." "I know," Nadia said. Josie went back to the drawing. The office held the quiet of a room where something had been said that both people had agreed silently to let stand. At 5 o'clock, Caleb packed up Josie's supplies and said goodbye from the doorway, Josie beside him with her backpack and sketchbook. "Thank you for letting her come," Caleb said. "She was good company." Josie waved. "See you next time," she said, with the certainty of someone for whom next time was a settled fact. After they left, Nadia sat for a while in the quiet office. The city outside was doing its December thing, shorter light, harder cold, the particular urgency of a place deciding whether to slow down for the season or keep going through it. She looked at the drawing on the shelf. She looked at it for a long time. The crisis came in January. She had expected a Douglas move. She had not anticipated the specific shape of it. He had found something she hadn't guarded closely enough. The new therapy protocol, the Atrium Health appointments. Not the results. Douglas had no access to her medical records. But he had found, through a source she would spend 3 weeks identifying, that she had been attending twice-weekly medical appointments at an Atrium facility. And he had shared this, framed as a question about executive availability, with 2 board members before a critical January investor call. She found out at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning when her board chair called her to say that there was a concern, and she needed to be on a call at 9. She was on the call at 9. There were 4 board members on the call, plus Douglas, plus the chair. The concern had been framed as due diligence. The investor group they were pursuing, a $100 million federal infrastructure fund that Nadia had been building toward for 6 months, had apparently received a communication, provenance unspecified, noting concerns about leadership stability at Crane and Lior. The investor fund had put the conversation on hold pending clarification. The call lasted 90 minutes. She answered every question with data. She addressed the attendance record. She addressed the investor concern. She did not address Douglas directly. What she understood during the 90 minutes was the specific architecture of what he'd done. He had not fabricated anything. He had taken accurate information, that she was attending medical appointments twice a week, that these appointments were for ongoing treatment, that there was uncertainty in the outcome, and he had placed it in a context that made it sound like risk. He had turned her recovery into a liability. It was, she had to admit, well executed. When the call ended, she sat in her office for 4 minutes. Not because she needed the time, she knew exactly what she was going to do, but because she had been maintaining a particular stillness since 7:30 in the morning, and she needed 4 minutes to let herself feel what she actually felt before she shifted back into operational mode. What she felt was not anger. It was something colder and more clarifying. 11 months. She had held this company together for 11 months of rebuilding a life and relearning a body and managing a board, and doing all of it at a standard that no one would have found acceptable to question if she had walked into those boardrooms on her own 2 feet. And Douglas Hale had taken the one thing she had kept private, the possibility of something getting better, and weaponized it. 4 minutes. Then she called Caleb. He was at his desk. He came in and she told him what had happened, and she told him all of it this time. The 11 months, the therapy, what Dr. Pierce had found, what Tess and Pierce were working toward. She told him because she needed someone to know the whole shape of it, not the professional shape or the medical shape, the actual shape, and he was the person she trusted with it. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. Douglas went to the board with half a story in a frame, he said. Yes. And the investors heard it through whatever channel he used. Yes, he looked at his hands. Can you prove it was him? Not directly, not yet. What do you need? She told him. She needed the investor communication traced. She needed the board member conversations documented. She needed to rebuild the trust that Douglas had leveraged, and she needed to do it before the Q4 earnings presentation in 3 weeks. And the fund, Caleb said. I need to get in front of them directly. Not through an intermediary, not through the presentation. In person. Who's the decision maker? She named the deputy director. Caleb knew him not personally, but through 2 degrees of contact, through the dot network he'd been building. I can get you the introduction, Caleb said. She looked at him. I've been working the relationship for the threshold pitch anyway, he said. I can bring the meeting forward. Make it about the federal accessibility infrastructure opportunity and let the Q4 numbers speak alongside it. She studied him. That's not how this is supposed to go. The threshold pitch was a second quarter conversation. The second quarter conversation becomes a non-starter if Douglas succeeds in January. He met her eyes. You built something worth protecting. Let's protect it. She had heard that framing before. She had used it herself once in a very different context. Hearing it directed at her from someone who meant it landed differently than she expected. All right, she said. Set the meeting. He set the meeting in 12 days. She spent those 12 days building the case alongside him, Q4 performance, the threshold concept, the dot opportunity, the federal fund alignment. They worked late 3 nights out of the 12, and on the 3rd night at 9:30, after her assistant had gone home and the building had gone quiet, Caleb pushed back from the conference table and said, How are you doing? Not the work, the rest of it. She looked at the documents spread between them. The therapy is hard, she said. Some of it is harder than anything I've done since the accident. There are nights when everything that was quiet starts making noise and I can't sleep. She paused. There are sessions where something happens that I can't account for, where the work is doing something I was told wasn't possible. He didn't say anything, he waited. I was told at the beginning, she said, that there was a clear picture, a definitive answer, that the question of what was possible had been answered. She looked at the window. It hadn't been. The imaging was incomplete. The characterization was incomplete. I spent 11 months operating on a map that was missing part of the territory. Caleb was still. I'm not angry at anyone in particular, she said. I have tried to be because it would be simpler, but mostly I am just recalibrating. She looked at him. What I know is that there is work to be done and there is a window for it and I am in it, and that is the only thing that is useful to hold on to. He looked at her for a moment. In the airport, he said. That morning, she waited. I almost didn't stop, he said it plainly. I was late. I had the supplier meeting and I had Josie's concert and I had 17 things going. And then I slowed down and I don't know exactly why. She held his gaze. I didn't make it to Mara, he said. When she collapsed, I was at an airport, different city, and I got on the plane because it was the next meeting and there was always a next meeting and she was fine. She was always fine. And by the time I landed, she was already gone. He stopped. I sat in the hospital waiting room for 2 hours before anyone told me, and I sat there thinking about the last time I'd seen her, which had been 3 days earlier because I'd been traveling, and the last thing I'd said to her was, "I'll call you when I land." A pause. I didn't call when I landed. I had a meeting. He looked at his hands. I've been in airports ever since. That's the job, that's what I do. And every time I'm in an airport and something needs doing and I could just walk past it, I was never going to do that again. I was already decided, I just didn't know it yet. The room was very quiet. "Caleb," she said, "yeah, I'm glad you were late." His expression shifted, something breaking open in it that he let break. "So am I." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not for long, just long enough to let it mean what it meant. Then she pulled her hand back and looked at the documents. "We should finish the dot section," she said. "Yeah," he said. "We should." They finished the dot section and the Q4 summary and the threshold framework, and it was past 11 when she finally left the building. She drove home thinking about Mara and about the airport and about the specific geometry of a decision made in a moment of lateness that had become the door to everything after. She thought about the boarding pass he'd been carrying when he'd turned around and walked beside her. She thought about the recorder concert he hadn't made. She thought about 11 months of people who had walked past things that needed doing and left her to manage them alone, and one man who had slowed down. It was, she thought, the simplest and most complete thing she knew about him. The federal fund meeting was on a Friday in early February. The deputy director was a careful, deliberate man named Marcus Teal, who had the quality of someone who had been in government long enough to know exactly what the difference was between a company making claims and a company proving them. He did not make things easy. He asked hard questions. He pushed on the threshold concept until it creaked. Caleb answered the operational questions. Nadia answered the strategic ones. And at one point, 20 minutes into it, Marcus Teal asked a question she had not expected. "Ms. Vasquez," he said, "the threshold concept, this idea of infrastructure designed around lived experience rather than compliance minimums, where does that come from for you?" The room was very quiet. She said, "I have spent 11 months navigating a world that was built to technically accommodate me and functionally fails to. Every day I work in a building that is accessible on paper and difficult in practice. I manage clients whose facilities comply with every federal standard and remain genuinely inaccessible to the people they serve." She held his gaze. "Threshold is built by someone who has had to map every door before she walked through it. That is not a perspective you can hire. It is either there or it isn't." Marcus Teal looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. "Send me the full proposal." On the drive back to the office, Caleb said, "He's going to fund it." "He hasn't funded it yet." "He's going to." He was looking at the road. "You could see it when you answered that question." She looked out the window at the February Charlotte afternoon. She had spent 11 months learning to live without the specific hope of anything working out the way she'd built it. She was being careful with this. "Maybe," she said. The proposal went out Monday. Marcus Teal's office confirmed an intent to proceed by the following Friday. She was at PT when the confirmation came through. She saw it on her phone between the parallel bar work and the weight-bearing exercises. She put the phone in her bag and told Dr. Pierce she was ready to continue. On the drive home, she thought about what Marcus Teal had said after her answer, that specific question about where the threshold concept came from. He had looked at her for a moment and said simply, "That's the kind of perspective that doesn't get built in a conference room." She had said, "No, it doesn't." She had spent 11 months being asked in various registers to treat the last 11 months as a problem to be managed, a liability to be disclosed, a gap to be closed, a chapter to be concluded. Douglas had done it. Her father had done it. Brennan had done it in the most expensive way possible. Marcus Teal had looked at it and seen a qualification. She thought about that all the way home, about how long she had been defending the last 11 months instead of using them, about the amount of energy that had gone into demonstrating that she was still the same person she'd been before the helicopter, when the actual truth was stranger and more interesting. She was not the same person. She was a different person, with a different map, and the map covered territory that no one who had not been where she'd been could have drawn. That was threshold. That was the whole idea. She sat in her apartment with the confirmation in her inbox and thought about the woman who had been sitting against the column in the departures hall 11 months ago, holding the calendar invite for an investor meeting she was no longer sure she could get to, with no one coming. She had gotten to the meeting. She had gotten to a better meeting. Tess and Dr. Pierce had adjusted the protocol in January based on the month's progress. The electrical stimulation had moved to a more targeted regimen. The weight-bearing work had escalated. Something was happening that neither Tess nor Pierce was naming yet, because they were careful people who did not name things until they were sure. But Nadia felt it. In the sessions and afterward, and in the small hours when the neural reactivation work made her body strange and loud and unfamiliar and almost alive. The moment happened on a Tuesday in late February. She was at the parallel bars with both hands gripping, working through the standing protocol, weighted, graduated, 10-second intervals of full load. She had been doing this variation for 3 weeks. She was at the 8th interval when Dr. Pierce, who had come in to observe, said, "Caleb." Nadia released the bar for a half-second and Pierce said, "Hold." What Pierce said next was clinical. What it meant was not. Her right leg had taken weight without the bar. Not intentionally, not as a breakthrough she had prepared for. For 4 seconds, while she was reaching to adjust her grip, her right leg had stood on its own. She gripped the bar again. She looked down at her leg. She looked at Pierce. 4 seconds, Pierce said. She was writing. "What does that mean?" Pierce set the clipboard down. "It means we're going to do this again on Thursday, and then again on Friday, and then I'm going to tell you what I think." Nadia stood at the bar with both hands holding it and her right leg remembering something it was not supposed to be able to remember, and she said nothing because there was nothing to say yet, nothing that was ready to be said. She looked at the wall in front of her. The same wall she had been looking at for 3 months of sessions, plain and institutional, the kind of wall that didn't know it was significant. She looked at her hands on the bar. She looked at her right foot, flat on the mat, weight passing through it for the first time in 11 months. She had spent 11 months learning not to want things that weren't available to her. She had learned it well. She had learned it the hard way, which was the way it stuck. And now she was standing at a parallel bar in a rehabilitation room in Charlotte, and her right leg had done something it had not done in 11 months, and she was not ready to call it hope yet, but she was aware, with a precision that lived somewhere below language, that the thing she had been careful not to want had come and stood beside her without asking for permission. She drove to the office. She went to Caleb's office and knocked on the open door. He looked up. "Something happened at PT this morning," she said. "My right leg stood on its own for 4 seconds. He looked at her, just looked at her. "Dr. Pierce says Thursday and Friday, and then she'll tell me what she thinks. She hasn't said anything." Nadia stood in the doorway. "I didn't want to say it to anyone else first." Caleb stood up from his desk. He crossed the room and stood in front of her and looked at her the way he had looked at her in the airport conference room 11 months ago. Not with pity, not with performance, with the specific attention of someone who was entirely there. 4 seconds, he said. 4 seconds. He reached out and took her hand, and she held his, and neither of them said anything else. She looked at their hands, at the window, at the Charlotte morning outside. She thought about the boarding pass in her jacket pocket. She thought about the airport column, the 33 minutes, the concierge service that hadn't come. She thought about 4 seconds of her right leg deciding without being asked to hold. The Threshold Systems launch was in April. Douglas Hale resigned from Crane and Lior in March, submitted with a professional courtesy letter and a timeline that was, she thought, him understanding the landscape before it shifted further. She accepted the resignation without meeting with him about it. She sent a company-wide note about transition leadership and hired his replacement from her own team. The board approved the threshold spinout in a meeting that lasted 40 minutes. Marcus Chen, who had been quietly supportive for 2 months, moved the vote. It passed unanimously. The federal fund commitment was in place. The DOT contract was in place. The framework Nadia had been building in her head for 6 months was on paper. The launch event was at a hotel in downtown Charlotte, the kind of space that could hold 150 people and make them feel like they were part of something that mattered. Nadia had overseen every element of it. She had the eye for what landed and what performed, and she could tell the difference. Josie was there. She had been specific about this. She wanted Josie there, and when she'd told Caleb, she'd watched his expression move through something that she'd come to understand as his version of being moved, quiet and complete, with none of the dramatics that lesser people used to cover the real thing. Josie sat in the front row in a dark red dress with her sketchbook on her lap, and she was drawing throughout the opening remarks and still drawing when Nadia took the podium. Nadia spoke for 20 minutes. She spoke about the gap between compliance and function, about the systems built for a theoretical person instead of the actual people who moved through them. She spoke about what it cost, in time and energy and quiet defeat, to navigate a world that had technically accounted for you and practically forgotten to. And then she said, "This company was made possible by a lot of people who gave a lot of things. My team who did the work. My board who believed in the numbers. And one person who, about a year ago, missed a flight he was trying to catch and spent 15 minutes making sure I got through an airport instead. He didn't know that was the beginning of anything." She looked at Caleb at the table in the second row. "I do." There was applause. Caleb looked at the table in front of him for a moment and then looked up at her, and the look was everything she had learned to read in a year, no performance, all of it real. After the event, after the handshakes and the conversation and the hour of work that always followed, they were in the hotel corridor waiting for the cars when Josie appeared at Nadia's side. "I drew you," she said. She held out the sketchbook, open to a page that showed Nadia at the podium, not a perfect rendering, but accurate in the way Josie's drawings were always accurate, which was in the details that mattered. The posture, the angle of the chair, the way Nadia's hands rested on the podium when she was making a point. "Can I keep it?" Nadia asked. "It's yours," Josie said. "I already signed it," she had. Bottom right corner in careful capitals, Josie Morrow. Nadia looked at the drawing. She looked at Josie, who was watching her with the specific attention of a 7-year-old who had been paying attention to everything. "Thank you," Nadia said. Josie nodded. "You're good at talking," she said. "Like you know what you're going to say before you say it." "I practice." "Why?" "Because the words matter, and so do the people you're saying them to." Josie considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything. Then she slipped her hand into Nadia's briefly, unself-consciously, the gesture of a child who had decided something without making a thing of it, and then let go and went to find her father. Nadia sat with the drawing in her lap and the hotel corridor emptying around her, and she thought about how small the airport column had seemed 11 months ago. How ordinary, a pillar in a departures hall, nothing notable, nothing special. And the morning coming apart around her in the quiet way things came apart when no one was watching. One man had slowed down, that was all. He had been late and he had slowed down and he had said matter-of-factly, "I can walk beside you," and she had said, "All right." The cars came. Caleb came back from wherever Josie had dragged him and stood beside her chair. "Good event," he said. "Yes." The federal fund director was pleased. He told Marcus Chen it was the most specific pitch he'd heard in 3 years. "Good." She looked at the drawing. "Josie's getting better. She practices every day." He was quiet for a moment. "She asked me last week if you were going to be around for a long time." Nadia looked up. "I told her I thought so," he said. "She said good because she wanted to draw you when you were taller." The thing about hope was that it took time to learn to hold it without bracing for the moment it would be taken. Nadia had spent 11 months learning to live without it and was learning, more slowly, how to live inside it. Not the grand version, not the version that promised everything, but the ordinary version. The version that said 4 seconds, and then Thursday, and then again. The version that said there are things you build one day at a time and they are not the same as things you build all at once, but they are more real. "When I'm taller," she said. Those were her words. She looked at the drawing in her lap, then at the door, then at Caleb. "Take me home," she said. "He got the cars." Dr. Pierce gave her the full assessment in April, 3 weeks after the launch. The language she used was careful and specific and declined to overpromise anything. She said, "The pathway integrity is sufficient for continued functional recovery." She said, "The current trajectory indicates the possibility of unassisted standing within 6 months, assisted walking within the year, unassisted ambulation at an indeterminate but not impossible horizon." She said, "I do not want you to think of this as an outcome. I want you to think of it as a process that has no guaranteed endpoint, but that is going in a direction we did not believe possible 11 months ago." Nadia sat in Dr. Pierce's office and listened and said, "What do we do next?" Pierce said. "What we've been doing. Only more." She thought about February, the plateau that had come without warning in week 10 of the new protocol, when the numbers stopped moving and the sessions felt like doing all the right things into a silence that wasn't listening. She had sat in that silence for 2 weeks and not stopped going, not changed the schedule, not reduced the scope of the work even on the days when the work seemed to be returning nothing. Tess had told her at the end of the second plateau week, "You're further along than the plateau feels. The body consolidates before it advances. You're consolidating." She hadn't believed it entirely, but she'd gone back the next Tuesday. The plateau broke in the 3rd week. She had felt it break, not dramatically, not with any announcement, just a quality in the session that was different, like a door that had been sticking suddenly opening flush with its frame. Pierce had been watching the data and had called her that evening to say, "Something moved today. I want you back in on Thursday." On Thursday, Pierce had run the full assessment for the first time since January. Now she was sitting across from the results. "What do we do next?" she said again. Pierce said, "What we've been doing, only more." She scheduled the next 6 weeks and drove to the office. She did not tell anyone about the assessment for 3 days. Not because she was afraid of it, she was, a little the way you were afraid of anything whose failure you had not yet prepared for, but mostly because she wanted to hold it for a moment before it became something shared, something public, something that had to be managed alongside all the other things she managed. On the 3rd day, she told Caleb. She told him what Pierce had said, the timeline, the trajectory, the careful language of possible. She told him in his office in the late afternoon with the Charlotte light coming in sideways and the Q2 projections on his whiteboard and everything ordinary about the room exactly as it always was. He listened the way he listened to everything. When she finished, he said, "What does it feel like?" She thought about it. Not the clinical version, she had the clinical version. The other version. "Like a door I was told was closed," she said. "Opened." He nodded. "Not all the way," she said, "and I don't know where it goes yet, but it's open." He leaned back in his chair. He looked at her with the look that was not the experiment look, not the professional look, the one she had been watching develop since November, the one that had no name yet and probably didn't need one. "Nadia," he said. "Yeah, I kept the boarding pass." She looked at him. "From the flight," he said. "The one I didn't take, I don't know why I kept it. I found it in my jacket pocket 2 weeks later and I kept it." He opened his desk drawer and took out a folded piece of paper and set it on the desk between them. "It seemed like the kind of thing you kept." She looked at it. Charlotte to New York, 9:20 a.m., the date of the morning she had been sitting against the column. She looked at it for a long time. "It was your flight," she said. "I took the next one." "You never said." "You didn't need it to be a thing." She looked at the boarding pass. A piece of thermal paper already faded at the edges, the text soft from being handled. It was the smallest possible object. It was 11 months of everything that had happened after. She reached across and took it. She put it in her jacket pocket. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "For the boarding pass, for missing the flight." He was quiet for a moment. And then, because he was Caleb Morrow and he did not make things more complicated than they needed to be, he said, "Anytime," she laughed. A real one, full and sudden, the involuntary kind. He smiled, and it was the smile she had been watching for months, the one that didn't manage itself. She looked at her hands and the window and the Q2 projections and the ordinary fact of the room around them. "We should finish the quarterly review," she said. "Yeah," he said. "We should." In May she stood. Not in a session, not with Pierce there, not at the parallel bars. On a Tuesday morning she was at the threshold of her own office. the door she had gone through 100 times, and Tess had been working with her for an hour on a transitional exercise, and Tess was off to the side making a note, and Nadia had both hands on the doorframe and she thought. And she let go. 6 seconds. 6 seconds of standing at the door of her own office, her own company, the thing she had built and held and refused to give away, with her 2 feet on the floor and nothing holding her up but herself. The hallway was quiet. The building was doing its morning thing, voices from somewhere down the corridor, the distant sound of the elevator, the ordinary machinery of a company in motion. None of it knew anything was different. Her legs were shaking. The controlled kind, the kind that came from muscle doing something new and asking every question at once. She put her hands back on the doorframe. Tess looked up from her clipboard. She didn't say anything. She wrote something down. 6, Nadia said. 6, Tess confirmed. They looked at each other. Nadia looked at the hallway. The conference room through the glass wall, the whiteboard with the threshold systems Q2 plan still up from yesterday. Charlotte outside the window, unremarkable and lit and going about its business. She looked at the doorframe under her hands. She had been at this doorframe 400 times in 6 years. She had come through it on her first day running the company, on the day she'd closed the federal contract that had changed the company's trajectory, on the day she'd come back to work 8 months after the helicopter with the specific determination of someone who had already decided the argument. She had been at this threshold so many times it was furniture. 6 seconds of standing in it felt like the whole of everything. Tess said, "We'll add it to the log." "Yes," Nadia said. She put herself back in the chair and went down the hall to Caleb's office. She knocked. He looked up. 6 seconds, she said. He stood up. She held up one hand. "Don't make it a thing." "I'm not making it a thing." "You absolutely are." He sat back down. Looked at her with everything on his face and none of it performed. 6 seconds, he said. At the doorframe, Tess was there. He nodded once. He looked at the window. "When I was 8 years old," he said, "I decided I was going to be an engineer because I wanted to understand how things held together, how something that looked like it shouldn't work actually worked." He paused. "I still think about that." She looked at him. "You held together," he said simply. "Through all of it, you held." Sat with that. Outside, Charlotte was doing its May thing, warm and full, the particular green of a city deciding to be alive again after winter. The light through the office windows was the kind that made everything look like it had been there for a long time and would be there for longer. She reached into her jacket and took out the boarding pass. She set it on his desk. He looked at it. "I think it's yours now," she said. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked it up and held it and set it back down. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means I don't need to hold on to it anymore," she said, "because what it was pointing toward is here." He looked at her across the desk, and the look had a name now. She just hadn't been ready to use it yet. She was ready. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah, I don't know how to do this carefully," she said. "I've tried to figure out the careful version and there isn't one. There's just," she looked at her hands, saying the true thing. He waited. "I love you," she said. "I don't know when that started. It started before I knew what to call it. And I'm telling you now because I'm done keeping it in the category of things I'm not prepared to hold." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "The airport. What about it?" "I knew something when I saw you against that column," he said. "I didn't have words for it, but I knew that if I walked past I would spend the rest of my life knowing I had." He paused. "That's not something you feel about a stranger. That's something you recognize." She held his gaze. "I love you, Nadia," he said. "I've been in love with you since November and I have been approximately terrible at not showing it." She laughed, again the involuntary kind, the kind that came from being exactly known. He came around the desk and sat in the chair beside her, not in front of her, not behind, beside her, which was the right geometry for everything they were. He took her hand. She held it. Outside, Josie was probably at school right now, sketching something in the margins of a notebook, making the world more documentable than she found it. Tess was probably writing up the session notes that would become part of a medical record that would say, in careful clinical language, that the picture had been incomplete and the territory was larger than the map. Marcus Teal was probably reading Q1 projections for threshold systems and deciding that the federal fund commitment had been the right one. And Nadia Vasquez was sitting in her office with the boarding pass on the desk and a man's hand in hers, and the Charlotte morning outside the window, and 6 seconds at a doorframe still running through her like the start of something. She went home that evening and sat in her apartment and looked at her hands for a while. There had been a version of this year that she had been dreading since the helicopter. The version where she held the company and lost the board and found a way to survive alone, the way she had survived the first year after the crash. That version had been possible. She had run the numbers on it. She had accepted it quietly as the cost of the injury and of Brennan, and of the kind of life she had built around the assumption that she was the only reliable constant. That version had not happened. What had happened instead was a departure hall, a man in a gray canvas jacket, a boarding pass that sat in a desk drawer for 11 months before it found its place. A daughter who drew everything she saw because she understood that some moments were worth documenting before they changed. A therapy protocol that nobody had thought to run because everyone had assumed the question was answered. She had spent 11 months being told in various ways that the story was over. It wasn't over. She understood now that this was the thing worth holding onto if this story was worth anything at all. The map is not the territory. The diagnosis is not the person. The board's concern about executive availability is not the company. The fiancé who said, "I can't handle this," is not the evidence that no one can. She had learned, slowly and at great cost, not to outsource her story to the people who found it inconvenient. Caleb had not found it inconvenient. He had found it without drama, without performance, exactly what it was. A person worth knowing, in the full shape of everything she was. That was the whole of the gift. She turned off the lights and went to bed, and the Charlotte night was quiet outside her window, and the boarding pass was on Caleb's desk in the office across the city, and Josie Morrow was asleep somewhere with her sketchbook on the nightstand, and the world was going to need all the maps they could draw of it. She was already working on the next one. The man who stopped for the woman who'd been left. The single father who gave something up and got something back. The broken CEO and the stranger who believed in her. That version is cleaner. It is also wrong. What actually happened was two people who had each built a very effective wall around the part of themselves that knew how to need things. Caleb had built his after Mara. Not obviously, he kept functioning. He kept loving Josie. He kept showing up. He was, to all appearances, a man who had gotten through the worst thing and come out reasonably intact. But he had decided, somewhere in the airport where he'd sat waiting for a flight while his wife collapsed on a floor 1,000 miles away, that the cost of being in the wrong place when it mattered was too high to carry, and that the solution was to stop mattering to anyone who could be hurt by his absence. He had turned the grief into motion, into the next job, the next contract, the next city. Into Josie's schedule and the Thursday pickups and the careful logistics of a life managed rather than lived. He was very good at showing up. He had become, without meaning to, someone who could not stay still. The airports were not incidental. They were the whole shape of his avoidance. Nadia had built her wall after the helicopter, in the specific way that people built walls when they had been shown, several times in succession, that the people they counted on had a limit. Brennan had had a limit. Her father had had a limit. The board had a limit. The investors had a limit. She had learned the limit and she had worked inside it, building a life that required nothing from anyone she couldn't produce herself. She was extraordinary at it, which was the problem. When you are extraordinary at not needing people, you get very good at mistaking independence for safety. They were both wrong. They were wrong in the understandable human way. The way that looks like wisdom from the inside and looks like armor from the outside and feels, when it finally comes down, like setting something very heavy on the ground and being surprised by how much lighter the air is. What Caleb gave Nadia was not rescue. He did not fix her. He did not save her from anything. What he gave her was the particular stubbornness of a man who looked at the full picture, the chair, the board, the cold competence she used as a perimeter, and declined to adjust his expectations downward. He had no stake in a version of her that was diminished. He was not comfortable with it, and he had not pretended to be. He saw her before she let him. That was the whole of it. What Nadia gave Caleb was the permission to be somewhere that mattered. He had been in transit for 2 years, figuratively and literally, between jobs and airports, and the logistics of a life he was managing rather than living. She had been the reason he stopped. And stopping, it turned out, was the thing he had been making himself forget how to do. She was also, which neither of them had fully articulated, the first person since Mara who had asked him to build something with her rather than just maintain something for someone else. There was a difference between showing up and being needed, between being useful and being wanted. She had wanted him, his specific knowledge, his specific way of seeing, his specific stubborn willingness to do the work that hadn't been asked for yet. That was not the same as the freight contracts. That was something older and more real. Josie understood it before either of them said it, because she was 7 and had not yet learned to make simple things complicated. She had walked into an office and drawn what she saw, and what she saw was two people who were, without discussing it, already each other's. She was going to draw Nadia when she was taller. She was going to get the chance. The boarding pass stayed on Caleb's desk, under a paperweight, slightly faded, going softer at the edges with age. Sometimes Josie picked it up and looked at it. Sometimes Nadia held it for a moment absently while she was reading something else. It was a small thing, a piece of thermal paper with a flight number and a date and a seat assignment that had never been used. Some things that go unused are wasted. This one was not. This one was a door that got left open when it could have been closed on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a departures hall by a man who slowed down when he didn't have to. That was the whole of it. The refusal to walk past. The staying when staying cost something. It was not a grand gesture. It was not a story with a clean hero. It was just a man who missed a flight and a woman who let him. And the rest was built one day at a time from that.